one of the stranger parts about Michael Cohen's testimony is he uses the language of therapy to describe crimes. And I'll be honest, it's not a good look for therapy. If that's what you think therapy is, like, he needs to maybe get different therapy.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen.
I object to you getting one.
And now, if you don't mind, I'm going to go into the icebox and sit for a long time. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Trump Trials Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and here's the rest of our team today.
Rhonda Colvin.
James Hellman.
Devlin Barrett.
And joining us from New York City is Shayna Jacobs. Shayna's our New York-based reporter covering courts, law enforcement, and criminal justice. And she has been very busy day in, day out covering the Trump trial. So the jury's getting some time off right now, which frankly feels a little weird to me. I can only imagine how it feels to them. But they left the court on Tuesday, Devlin, and they're going back next Tuesday, the day after Memorial Day. At that point, they'll hear closing arguments, hear their instructions, and they will begin to deliberate in this historic case. Am I the only one who finds this incredibly weird that they go about their normal lives for the week and then have to jump back into it?
No, it is very weird. I can't think of a break this long in a trial I've covered. And the judge did it this way because they were already going to have Wednesday off. That's been a standard thing for this trial. And that this particular week, they were going to have Friday off, the day before the holiday, because a juror had travel plans. So the judge did not want to break up the closing arguments and the deliberations with days off. He thought it was most important that the jury be able to start deliberating right after they heard closing arguments. So he basically picked the lesser of two evils. It is strange. I do think you run the risk of the jurors going home and just thinking to themselves on this issue for a long period of time, or the other risk is the jurors just forget a lot of the things that they have heard and thought about. I just watching the jury, they seem very diligent. I would be a little surprised if forgetting is much of an issue for them. Some of them are very diligent note takers, but it is weird, and certainly it makes for a different kind of closing arguments.
You know, I'm almost feeling like it's like mile 25 of the marathon. They're like, take a break. And that can either have the effect of like recharging you and focusing you, or being like, peace out, like I am done, like I am checking out. And what do you guys think? Is this?
I also think about what comes after all of this. Yeah. Whatever happens, whether it's a conviction, hung jury, or whatever, these jurors are still attached to this case, right? They're going to be hounded by media to see, including us. We want to hear, if they want to talk to us, we want to hear what went on, what their thought process was. But you know, this is now going to be a part of their life. So I feel like even though they're at the end, it's maybe the beginning for a lot of them.
For some of these jurors, it'll be the lead paragraph in their obituary that they were a Trump juror. I do think it's always perilous to sort of put yourself in the jurors' heads because we have no idea what they're thinking. And you can game it out so many ways, but is there a scenario where there is one juror who sort of thinks Trump isn't guilty and is going to harden in that view over their week off? And really, the other thing is jurors aren't supposed to talk to people outside of court, and they make a huge deal about that. But it's going to be pretty clear.
It's such a social weekend.
And it's a social weekend. And so are jurors, is inappropriate as that would be, going to be, for lack of a better word, lobbied by people who know that they're jurors, whether that's close friends or family.
Yeah, you all are thinking about it from the perspective of like the legalities of it and the strategy of it. I was thinking about it from the perspective of just the juror, of just feeling like, oh my gosh, like this is not, I have to put this on the shelf in my mind, but the experience isn't over yet. So.
I also think there's a world in which it makes the closing arguments even more important than they would otherwise be, because there's such a long break. And part of what I think as human beings they might go through when they have the closing arguments now is like, okay, yeah, remind me about all this stuff. You're hearing it in some ways more freshly. Like if you have closing arguments right after you've heard the evidence, the jurors themselves know what the evidence is. I think there's a chance they might be more persuadable by closing arguments because there's more time removed from the actual evidence.
Okay, so in that case, that last mile of the marathon they'll be like revved up and ready to go. Well, we're going to talk about what to watch in those very vital closing arguments on today's episode, and also what the strongest and weakest parts of the case as we've heard it are. And then we'll go through possible outcomes. And while I'm not going to pin you all down on what you think is going to happen, we are not wagering here. I do want to hear your sense and interpretation of where things are headed. So let's dive in. First, the strongest and weakest parts of the prosecution's case. Shayna, let's go to you. You've heard so much of it firsthand. What are the strengths of the case? What stands out to you?
What stands out to me is that there is a significant amount of evidence that supports Michael Cohen's story. And that is so key to the case because of Michael Cohen's potential credibility issues, his history of lying, he's a convicted felon, lied in formal settings, lied to Congress. It's just not ideal, but it's not out of the norm. I mean, you have cooperating witnesses who are gang members and who have killed people. I mean, this is not, it's out of the norm for a white collar case, but it is, it is not, it was going to be an issue going into this trial. And Cohen, who we know is very hot-headed, has a hair trigger temper, he was fine. He was not rattled. It was really good testimony in that sense. And the strongest part of the defense case is that it doesn't matter that he was really good. He is still a liar. He lies to get, he lies to get himself things. He lies to get, he's now very, very motivated to punish Trump because of what he believes Trump did to him.
Strongest and weakest parts of the case to you, Devlin.
We all went into this case knowing that Michael Cohen was a very important part of this case. I ended the trial thinking, God, he's even more important to this case than I thought when this thing started. Because yes, the paper is the paper and the paper is irrefutable, but Cohen is the one, in some ways the only one, who speaks to the actual intent of the cover-up of the payments. And that's really important. I also think the other really weak, potentially weak part of the case is the absence of Alan Weisselberg, Trump's former CFO. He's the person who gives Michael Cohen his instructions on this, even according to Michael Cohen. I just think his absence is in some ways a real gift to Trump as a defense. But, a lot of Trump's defense strategy here is arguably not ideal. Trump's trying to win every argument on every subject. Most defense lawyers would say that's a bad formula.
Do you think that's driven by Trump or by his lawyers?
I think most lawyers I talk to believe that's driven by Trump.
James?
The receipts are the key thing on the positive side. On the negative side, it's not just Weisselberg, it's also Keith Schiller, the bodyguard who supposedly got that phone call that became, I think, way more important than we had thought going in once Cohen said that was where Trump gave his authorization. Ultimately, there's only one witness who directly connects Trump to making these payments for election interference reasons. And I think the other big weakness in the case is the hoops that you sort of have to jump through, which is normally this would be a misdemeanor, falsifying business records. Normally the statute of limitations would have expired. They're making it a felony by saying that it was in commission of another crime. They've said what that crime is, which is essentially election fraud, trying to change the outcome of an election. And you do sort of have to jump through multiple hoops. And if you're trying to raise reasonable doubt about why Trump did it, even if he made the payments, maybe they did that. And I think that you could see doubts percolating potentially in the jurors' heads over the 5 weeks of this.
Before we hear, Rhonda, what you see as the strengths and weaknesses, let's drill down into that phone call that you were talking about, James. So Devlin and Shayna, I don't know if either of you were in court when sort of the big moment came where Blanche was questioning Cohen about the details of this phone call. Were either of you there?
Shayna was in the room. I was in the overflow.
Okay. So you can take us through sort of some of the details, but let me just set this up first. So there's this pivotal phone call, which becomes pivotal because Trump's lawyers are saying this was a phone call to Keith Schiller, who's like Trump's like body guy, right? Who's with him a lot, with him all the time. And isn't it true that you were discussing not a payment that has gone through, that's working out, or that you're working on with Stormy Daniels, but that instead you were talking to Schiller about these harassing phone calls that Cohen was getting, right? He's getting a ton of harassing phone calls. And this is a phone call about that specific issue. Have I summed that up decently well, Devlin?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think what was surprising and I think effective about the defense presentation was they presented the text leading up to the phone call. And I think the thing to always remember is that jurors are very good about applying common sense to what they're hearing. And when you see the text and then realize that Keith Schiller says, call me, and then there's a phone call and it's not very long.
And they're texting about these harassing phone calls.
Right, they're texting about the harassing phone calls. And Cohen initiates the text conversation, then Schiller says, call me. Normal people would look at that and say, that's believable. That's an entirely normal human conversation.
Okay, let's listen to some of this exchange. Now, these are our colleagues here at the Washington Post who are reading from the transcripts. Since we cannot be with cameras in the court or audio from the court, we do get the transcripts at the end of the day. And this is reading of the transcript. Now, this is not a dramatic reenactment. It is just giving us the words so we can have a better sense of it. The first voice that you'll hear are the words of Trump's lawyer, Todd Blanche, and the second voice you'll hear is Michael Cohen's words.
5 minutes ago, I asked you if you remember harassing phone calls, and you said no. And then I refreshed your recollection. It's totally fair if you don't remember. But now your testimony is that you were testifying truthfully on Tuesday to a 1 minute and 36 second phone call, and you had enough time in that 1 minute and 36 seconds to update Mr. Schiller about all of the problems you were having with those harassing phone calls, and also update President Trump on the status of the Stormy Daniels situation, because you had to keep him informed because every time you made any decision, you ran it by the boss. That's your testimony?
I always ran everything by the boss immediately. And in this case, it could have just been saying everything is being taken care of. It's going to get resolved.
That's not what you testified to on Tuesday. You said you had a recollection of a phone call on October 24th at 8:02 p.m. where you called Mr. Schiller and he gave the phone to President Trump, and you told President Trump about the updates, that you were moving forward with the funding, and he said, okay, go. That was a lie. You did not talk to President Trump on that night. You talked to Keith Schiller about what we just went through. You can admit it?
No, sir, I can't. I am not certain that is accurate.
That's a reading of testimony by Michael Cohen answering questions from Trump's lawyer, Todd Blanche. Again, that's our team reading the words. Shayna, was that a dramatic moment in real life?
It was very dramatic in real life. It went from, 20 to 100 very quickly in terms of like Todd Blanche's intensity in cross-examination. The danger of that moment, Michael Cohen stuck through it. He just looked incredibly caught off guard. Like he had not been prepared for this. It seemed very much like he had not been prepared for this. The danger, but he recovered and he provided a plausible answer. 1 minute and 36 seconds. Todd Blanche says it's not a lot of time, but if it takes 5 seconds to say, just tell the boss that thing we were working on is taken care of, that's plausible. And I think the jury might see that as perfectly plausible. It just took him a while to get to that answer because it did not seem like he had seen these texts in advance. That said, the jury might make more of that moment. They might say that if he didn't remember something significant about that call on his own, is he reconstructing the entire story from texts and what he, from records that the DA has? Is he reconstructing the reality? I don't know that they will make that much of it, but it does seem like a possibility that they will use that to sort of re-examine every other important element of Michael Cohen's direct testimony.
So Devlin, did Susan Hoffinger and the team sort of make a mistake in not prepping Michael Cohen with those texts? And when Shayna says that they recovered, 96 seconds. If I were the prosecution, I think I'd in my closing arguments make everyone sit there for 96 seconds and think about how much you can actually, that's a long time in terms of just like quick messaging back and forth in a phone call.
Right. I think it'll be, obviously, I think one of the things Shayna and I are looking for very much is how each side talks in closings about that. I do think making the jury sit through 96 seconds would be an effective way to make the case. I do think the defense in that instance on that issue caught the prosecution out, caught Cohen out, however you want to say it.
And by caught them out, it's not like caught them in trapped them in a lie or something. It's like they hadn't realized like there's this text chain leading up to the phone call.
Correct. And look, like I think too often, partly because of TV and movies, we think of lawyers as like these super geniuses. Trials are inherently bouncy and a bit of a roller coaster, and people make mistakes. That is part of the process. So I think, but for all intents and purposes, it feels like that's something that prosecutors missed. That's something that Cohen wasn't prepared for. And I think that showed in the moment.
But it seemed like they were able to do some cleanup.
Sure, yeah. I mean, look,
Not just in the moment, but later, because they were able to show the jury that Schiller and Trump were indeed together like 5 minutes before through a photo, like from C-SPAN, right? That on that day they were together.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll be honest, this is one of those details that I think reporters perceive differently than jurors, because anyone who's spent any time covering Trump on any level knows that Schiller was always with Trump. Like, there's no, like, that's not some great mystery. That's always been true. Schiller, for instance, was with Trump the night he was with Stormy Daniels many years earlier. He's basically been with Trump, as far as you can tell from the outside world, every night of their lives when he was in his employment. Again,
was that clear in court, though, to the jurors?
Well, that's my point. I think it's probably helpful to the prosecution. But I also think, again, to take things as I always try to perceive things in the most common sense way, because I think that's what jurors are usually looking for. And I think the most common sense way is Cohen got caught, wasn't sure what to do, and he looked on his face, and this is what matters, I think, to jurors quite a bit. He looked on his face like, oh, bleep. What am I going to say here? And Shayna's absolutely right. He did recover well, but you can't take back that expression. You can't take back that facial expression. And if you're asking me what I think they most carried away from that moment, it's not anything Cohen said, and it's really not anything Blanche yelled at him. It's the look on his face when Blanche says that.
Rhonda, strengths and weaknesses in the case. What do you see as the strengths of the prosecution and places where there might be holes and room for the jury to find Trump not guilty?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said about Cohen, and I believe Shayna said it. He is both the strength and the weakness in all of this. His credibility is the weakness. His strength is the evidence he was able to bring, the tangible evidence he was able to bring. I think one of the moments that I remember being a standout in the transcript is when the jury heard the tape between Cohen and Trump, where it's about the Karen McDougal payment, but it does appear that Trump understands what Cohen is saying when he's referring to the financing of this payment. I think that that's a crucial moment because A, it does show that Trump has some sort of awareness of what Cohen was doing, or at least the jurors might perceive that. And also B, because we did not hear from Trump, at least formally in this entire trial, the jury heard his voice. And I wonder if that's going to be pretty pivotal. That was the one time they were able to hear Trump talk about this case. And, you know, it does appear to look incriminating if you listen to it. We'll see if the jurors feel that way. But I think Cohen, the strength he brought to the prosecution is he did have receipts, literal receipts, invoices, and tangible evidence that could show what the prosecution is trying to prove.
Can we look at some of those pieces of evidence and invoices? We are streaming on YouTube, so for our YouTube audience, you can watch along with us. For those who are listening on podcast apps or on the Washington Post site, we'll explain what we're seeing. But let's just look at one of these pieces of evidence that was important. Why don't we throw up one of them? So this is a check that Donald Trump signed. And I think a lot of us know that Donald Trump signature. Why do we know it so well,
Well,
James?
he used to hold up, anytime he would sign a bill or an executive order, he would hold it up and do kind of a 180 to show off his signature.
And many Americans got checks during his administration
too.
with that signature on it, right? Which he sort of like breached norms and put it on there anyway. Devlin, why is that significant?
So that's significant because if I remember correctly, that check has a notation on it that says legal retainer. And that's sort of the heart of the prosecution case, that these were reimbursements for money to keep Stormy Daniels quiet. There's no legal retainer here. There's no retainer agreement here. This is all fake billing, essentially. That's the heart of the case.
And let's look at another piece of evidence that has really seemed to hit home. All right, handwriting. Handwriting is always important. There's the sort of the Trump logo right at the top. Shayna, can you see this piece of evidence with us?
I can, yes.
Okay, so there was testimony about just whose handwriting is on this and what it contains. Talk to us about it.
The prosecution believes this is absolutely key, that this might be their most important document in the entire case. It corroborates what Michael Cohen says. We talked about this, and we got together and we jotted down a plan. Obviously, does not look like a very formal legal plan, but it is something. It is something that exists and does not seem to be in dispute that this is what it appears to be.
This is said to be Alan Weisselberg's handwriting. We heard that in testimony. Now, even though we didn't hear from Alan Weisselberg, we did hear testimony from Trump's former comptroller about whose handwriting this was in. And if we can just look at it one more time, the numbers are important, right, James and Rhonda, because we're talking about the payment that he made to Stormy Daniels, and then it's also inflated.
Yeah, and so the idea is that Michael Cohen is getting reimbursed, and then he's getting reimbursed because he's going to have to pay tax. Plussed up was the terminology in court, where because he's being paid as if it's income for being a lawyer as opposed to a reimbursement. Like when you get your expenses reimbursed, they added in the tax premium, and it's Donald Trump had said in the past that he did reimburse Cohen. And Todd Blanche said, I think in opening arguments, that this was not a payback, but it sure looks like a payback when you look at the what's written down on the piece of paper.
Let's take a look at one third and final piece of evidence for today's show. And we also heard about this from Trump's comptroller, Devlin.
Right, and I believe it's, if I remember correctly, it's Alan Weisselberg's handwriting on the left side, where they're first sketching out how you get, because one of the hard things to explain about this case to the average person is how you get from a $130,000 hush money payment to a $420,000 reimbursement.
Sounds like a good deal to me.
It's the new math. But the point is that essentially, in Michael Cohen's telling, they threw in some other things that Michael Cohen was owed for. And so that's how, and because of the tax issue, they gross up, and then you get to the 420.
So for those of us who aren't watching, this is an account statement from First Republic Bank. It's a statement, but then there's the handwriting scribbled on the sides. And it's the comptroller and
right. And I think what's important about that, obviously, is it's the statement from the original payment to Stormy Daniels. And then you get all these other notations getting you up to a different figure. And obviously that's meaningful evidence because it draws a straight line. You know, why would you write this on this particular document if this was not the money for this repayment?
You know, I want to look at one thing there. There's plus $50,000 paid to Redfinch for tech services. Okay, why are you laughing, Devlin?
This was this is one of the other ways in which Cohen is both a great and terrible witness. He never helps. He never does 100% of anything. Like he never completely helps. He never completely hurts. So one of the things that Michael Cohen was paid back for, according to his testimony, was a services provided by a company called Redfinch. There was a CNBC poll about important business leaders in history. Donald Trump was low on the list. Donald Trump wanted to be higher on the list, according to Michael Cohen. And so Michael Cohen paid this tech services company to basically, as far as I can tell, as a non-technical person, spam the ever-loving heck out of this poll to move Donald Trump higher up the list. Their bill for that was somehow $50,000 because Cohen had a personal relationship with the person who ran Redfinch. Trump wouldn't pay because the poll essentially got shut down before he could, reap the rewards.
Like he was only number 9.
Right, and there was this whole weird discussion in testimony about we don't want him to be number 1 because that would look weird. We just want him to be hot.
So he reached the pinnacle of number 9, but then it didn't even matter anyway because they shut the whole thing down.
Right, and then Donald Trump doesn't want to pay the $50,000.
He didn't get his what he wanted.
Michael Cohen feels like he's in a bad spot. He says because this is his friend who did the work, and so Michael Cohen, in very Michael Cohen fashion, decides to pay his friend $20,000 in cash in a brown paper bag. How any of that makes sense, I have no idea. But anyway, that's what he does. Also, he takes that money out in a series of withdrawals from the bank, which I think Shayna and I would both agree sounds an awful lot like a kind of crime called smurfing. Technically, it's called structuring, but most lawyers use a shorthand called smurfing. I don't think the jury will pick up on any of this, but it just stinks. It just even the simplest things with Michael Cohen somehow end up sounding weird.
Okay, Devlin, so he pays this guy $20,000, but on that sheet it says Redfinch was paid $50,000.
Right, and this is where he hurts himself again as a witness, because what he admits to on the stand is that while he did get paid $50,000 by Trump for Redfinch, he basically pockets the other 30. And because it's doubled up, grossed up for tax purposes, what Trump really gives Cohen for Red Finch is $100,000. So it's a little hard to explain, but essentially the way to think of it is Michael Cohen pockets $30,000, and in the process, he's basically stealing $60,000 or so from the Trump organization, because the Trump organization is overpaying quite a lot to manage both Cohen deciding. And sorry, it's a mind-blowing, weird, small detail of this case. When he's asked about that, he admits that he stole, and he calls it self-help. Which is like, one of the stranger parts about Michael Cohen's testimony is he uses the language of therapy to describe crimes. And I'll be honest, it's not a good look for therapy. If that's what you think therapy is, like, he needs to maybe get different therapy.
Yeah.
It's very strange.
You know, Shayna, so the prosecution had brought this up, where they tried to deflate it, right? Make it like a non-issue. But then Todd Blanche brings it back later. So I want to play that I'm not going to call it a reenactment, the recreation of that part of the testimony. And then I want to get your response, Shayna. So the first voice you'll hear are the words of Trump's lawyer, Todd Blanche. The second voice you'll hear are the words of Michael Cohen. And they're talking about these payments for legal services and other things. Let's play the tape.
You never gave the $30,000 that was owed to the guy that owned Red Finch, did you?
No, sir.
So you stole from the Trump organization, right?
Yes, sir.
And you didn't just steal the $30,000, right? It was actually, because it was grossed up, it was $60,000.
Yes, sir.
Meaning, if you had been honest with Mr. Weisselberg and said, I'm only owed $20,000, and he grossed that up, that would have been 40, not 100, correct?
Correct.
And you told multiple prosecutors in the district attorney's office that story, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever have to plead guilty to larceny?
No, sir.
Have you paid back the Trump organization the money that you stole from them?
No, sir.
And you're hearing reading of the words of Michael Cohen and Todd Blanche. Shayna, was this a gotcha moment from Todd Blanche? Because he really, he accuses Michael Cohen of stealing this money. Like, he says the words out loud, basically. He says it's not, instead of using the words of therapy, he uses the word of crime.
Yeah, it was the first time that what we saw on that chicken scratch paper was actually framed as theft, grand larceny, but it was just another egg in the basket for Todd Blanche to argue to the jury that this guy is so dishonest, you can't believe a word he says. He steals from his boss, who he claims he was loyal to, who he once claimed he would take a bullet for. It's just not a good look. It also but the other aspect of this, and I'm not sure if the defense will argue this, is that the fact that they gave him $420,000 with the tax stuff, all that, I mean, he still made out better than he would have if he just got reimbursed $130,000. It kind of seems in some ways like it's a Trump to Cohen payoff. It's a Trump to Cohen hush money payment, because their relationship was ending, even though he came on as a personal attorney in 2017 when Trump took office. He wasn't doing any legal work for him. He did a couple of minor things, and I think he said he didn't even charge Trump for that. There was no retainer. There was no actual personal attorney relationship. I mean, Cohen had moved on to other things. So it does kind of seem like Trump and Weisselberg had constructed this in a way that they were sort of paying off Cohen to never talk about the things he had done for Trump, including paying off Stormy Daniels. That could be a significant thing if they decide to frame it that way.
So part of this closing argument phase will be reminding the jurors of testimony like that. So James, what do you think the prosecution and defense need to do to stitch things together in the closing arguments?
The prosecution needs to remind the jurors that Michael Cohen is not on trial, and that he's a terrible, flawed guy, but he did this thing to help this guy that's on trial commit a crime.
And he also has motivation to get the money back, right?
Yeah.
They've not painted him, like Hope Hicks in particular was used to paint Michael Cohen as not a generous giving guy, right? They've shown that he does favors for people when it benefits him ultimately.
Yeah. And
so he wants the money back.
He wanted, and he had his own interests. It was about Michael Cohen, not about Donald Trump. On the defense side, you just have to create reasonable doubt. You just have to, you don't need to convince 12 jurors. You only need to convince one or two that maybe this wasn't about the election. Maybe this was about Melania. Maybe Alan Weiselberg was freelancing and Trump was signing checks that were being sent to him. He was busy. He was president to reimburse Cohen, but that maybe this was something that was sort of happening behind Trump's back that he was vaguely aware of, that he didn't really know was about the election, and that Cohen is lying about this just as he's lied about everything else.
Devlin, what will you be watching for and listening for?
So I think what I'm going to be listening for is, in some ways, I think I understand what the prosecution argument is going to be. That you have a paper case here, and Michael Cohen fills in some critical blanks. And while you may find Michael Cohen to be a jerk, he is a credible jerk on this point. You don't need to like Michael Cohen. You just need to believe his version on like a few key points. I think in some ways the defense, I'll be much more curious to see what the defense argument makes, because in a lot of trials, the defense struggles to come up with an alternate explanation for events. I actually think the defense here, for all of Trump's, odd insistence on things that aren't relevant to guilt or innocence, I think the defense here has actually done a fairly good job of coming up with an alternate explanation for these events. Their alternate explanation is Michael Cohen is a lunatic and a liar and a thief. You just can't put anyone away on his word. And I think the strongest argument you can make as a defense in this case would be, whatever you think of Donald Trump, you would not want someone you care about to be convicted on the word of someone like Michael Cohen, period. And the system has to stand for that principle, otherwise the system breaks down. I'll be honest, I think there's a world in which they don't make that argument, because that argument acknowledges that Trump may be human or may be a flawed person. And one of the ways in which this trial has been weird is that Trump has clearly wanted to argue things like he never slept with Stormy Daniels. He has wanted to wage fights that aren't critical to this case. And I'll be watching to see if he keeps using the defense closing argument, the most important thing they do in this entire trial, to try to score points that matter to his ego, because that would be very dangerous, I think.
Shayna, what are you going to be watching for and listening for? Because you'll actually get to witness the closing arguments.
Yeah, Devlin said it really well. The defense has to do a very good job of mainly discrediting Michael Cohen and making him look like a completely unhinged lunatic who can't be trusted and is always hustling. He's a hustler who's always taking advantage of whoever he has to in order to make money, primarily. The other thing is, I think they will try to focus on the idea that this isn't campaign related. It's personal. Trump would have paid off, Stormy Daniels in a different situation in a year other than 2016 and, other than now. But I think they have to do a good job of constructing a narrative that says this was not anything to do with the election. This was, someone not wanting their reputation tarnished by this woman. That said, there's evidence of so many other, there's stories from so many other women. It's not something that was really, it got out of control, that narrative, again, that Trump, engages in misconduct with women. But they still, the jury doesn't know any of that. So the defense can paint a picture of this is just something any rich guy would do to protect himself and his business and his family.
All right, well, coming up next, the jury instructions and how vital they are to this whole process, and we'll get our panel to weigh in on what could actually happen. Stay with us. Hey, thanks for watching the Trump Trials Sidebar, along with me, Rhonda Colvin, and James Homan. And of course, our reporters who are in the room as we witness history and Donald Trump is on trial. We have a special offer for you to subscribe to the Washington Post. This is an offer that's available until June 3rd. It costs only 99 cents every 4 weeks, and it lasts for a full year. You get all the benefits of being a Washington Post subscriber, which include ad-free access to all of our podcasts, of course, all the great journalism we produce online. You can get access to everything from our newsletters, like the Trump trial, to things that you hear us talk about on this podcast. Go ahead, check it out. The way to find out more about it is visit WashingtonPost.com/subscribe. It just takes a minute. Thanks for watching. So jury instructions may seem like housekeeping or detail, but in this case especially, they are very important. Devlin, why are they so important this time around? And every time, let's say.
You're right. They're always important. I think they're particularly important in this case because the legal architecture of these charges are so, let's call it, unique. This is like a Russian nesting doll of crime. He's charged with a crime that is based on a different crime, which itself is based on a third crime, and that third thing is probably a federal crime, although the prosecutors have been given a lot of latitude to argue to the jury that it could be based on a number of different crimes. I don't know how the jury is going to process that. You know, I obsess about the common sense of jurors. I don't know what common sense creates that Russian nesting doll. So I just think it makes the charge that much more important.
And there are multiple lawyers on the jury.
There are 2 lawyers on the jury, yes, and that could be very important. I think that's one of the great unknowns of this process is how do those lawyer jurors think about what they've seen and heard.
Shayna, what did we learn in sort of the process of hashing out what some of these jury instructions would be like?
Yeah. So there's this idea that the law says that somebody can be guilty of falsifying business records if they cause a false entry. That is what the prosecution, I think it's actually just going to be part of the charge. It's sort of something that's indisputable. What is disputable is how campaign finance law gets explained to the jury. Again, they're going to try to use common sense, but it is going to be about whether the payments actually constituted, what constitutes a campaign finance violation. And there's arguments over that still, and we're going to find out the final instructions maybe in the next few days. But I think the defense and the prosecution are very far apart. The defense leaning toward the idea that it has to be entirely about the campaign. It has to be obviously about the campaign in order for that to be a campaign, an election law violation, as opposed to the prosecution, who firmly believes that it can be just partially about even protecting a campaign or, involving, it has to be partially about an expense related to the campaign. So that even if he thought this was partly personal to protect Melania and his family or whatever, that doesn't matter because it also benefited his campaign, and they're going to say that that's clearly the reality here.
And James, legal definitions are really important. And in fact, Trump's team wanted to have a witness testify, but he was not allowed to because there was concern that he would provide legal definitions in a way that really the judge wants to have control over.
Right, and ultimately wasn't able to testify. The judge also got angry at Robert Costello, who was the defense's witness, for doing what the judge thought was basically offering analysis of the law. There were sort of 2 interesting moments on Tuesday when they started talking about it's called a charging conference, which is basically how you put together these jury instructions. And Judge Merchan seemed poised to rule against prosecutors on what could be critical on this standard that the jury needs to find that the falsified record entries were reasonably foreseeable, that signing these checks and making these payments to Michael Cohen, that it was reasonably foreseeable that this was going to lead to falsified business records. And the judge seemed skeptical of that. On the flip side, Merchan also grew annoyed when the defense team tried to get language in the instructions basically saying that Trump made these decisions based on the involvement of his lawyers. And the judge has pushed back on that repeatedly over months and really has rejected what would be an advice of counsel defense. And that's where, when you look to what are they going to say in the closing arguments, that you could imagine Todd Blanche saying, look, Michael Cohen was Donald Trump's lawyer, and Michael Cohen told him this was okay and that this would pass legal muster, and Trump just was following bad legal advice. And the judge rejected that. I talked to a top Trump ally this morning who was feeling really good after the Cohen testimony wrapped up, but was feeling a lot less good after this charging conference. And the feeling was that the judge was limiting in unhelpful ways the arguments that they could make and to tee up these instructions where they could kind of push the jury toward certainly a hung jury, as much as no one expects an acquittal.
Okay, James opened the door. He cracked open the door to just what could happen. I want to hear from you in a minute, Rhonda, but James, since you opened the door, what are the options on the table here?
That's where you're talking to all these people who are following this
Yeah.
closely. Devlin and Shayna have obviously been in the room and have absorbed every minute of it. It seems like there's an outright acquittal seems super unlikely. That would mean that all dozen of the jurors have to agree that Donald Trump did not commit a crime.
Okay, let's pause there. Devlin, agree?
So this is going to sound a little snotty. I will say this. I think people make a lot of. This is the normal process. Humans want to like guess at outcomes. I think what happens a lot with trials, in my experience, is that we all make guesses. We are all, proven right or wrong in the very near future. But what also happens is, as soon as the verdict is in, everyone immediately recalibrates and says,
like, oh,
well, it was always going to be, it was always predestined that the outcome would be X. I just want to go on record, because I'm pretty sure we're recording this. I have no idea what the outcome will be. I've been surprised by juries. I've been not surprised by juries. I don't know.
All right, let's take it back to the options on the table, though. There's acquittal, which James is guessing is like a hard no. What are the other options, Rhonda?
Yeah, and I just have to say, I agree with Devlin. We don't know anything. The jurors are the only ones who can give us an answer whenever they have an answer. So, of course, there's acquittal, which he'd be free and clear. There is a hung jury, which would, just one juror would disagree with the rest of them and throw it into a situation where the judge would likely call a mistrial. And then, of course, you would have conviction. I think one of the things you have to remember, in those listening and watching us, is this case includes 34 counts that are very similar to each other. So if he is convicted on one count, it is likely that the other counts will follow suit. Although we just don't know. We don't know. But at the same time, this is not like a case you might have watched on TV where it's one count, wire fraud, one count something else. This is all very uniform.
It'd be really hard to split the baby on these charges.
Right. So,
I think that's true. Although remember, there are batches of documents. Like these count. Like there's basically 3 batches, and so I agree with you, because they're all the same count. And it's all the same activity. You're far more likely in a case like this to have all or nothing. But I do think the batches are the one caveat to that, where it's like, I guess in theory, the jury could decide, well, we'll give them a little there, take a little there. Jurors
Because there's
negotiate
like invoices
sometimes.
to Cohen, there's checks.
Right. There's different batches of documents
And then
that
there's
are
ledger entries, right?
Count. Yeah.
Okay. And Shayna, let's bring this to you for how the jury may be mulling all this over and thinking about this, and your thoughts on what you'll be watching for as the jury finally decides.
So they're only human. Of course, they're thinking about it. They're not supposed to be talking to anyone about it, including their spouses, their partners, their friends. So that's their mandate. Hopefully, they're not doing that. They will. It's going to be very interesting to see what notes they send. If they ask for testimony readbacks, it's going to be interesting to see which witness they want what read back, which part of that witness's testimony, if it's not the whole thing. There is a possibility that we'll be sitting there for hours or a day and a half listening to a court reporter reread what the jury already heard, reread the transcript. But if they ask for one thing or another, there's a possibility that they just give them a laptop with every piece of evidence on it. It's just never kind of a standard thing in New York State courts. So they're going to be sending us cues. Obviously, the cues are not for us. They're for them to get through their process. And we're all going to sit around and guess what it means. It may not mean anything. Devlin's right. It's very, very impossible to read what these people are thinking. Also, we're people who have been watching a lot of trials, and we know the system. And we have a different view of it than they do. There are a couple of lawyers on the panel, but they're also just regular people who don't do this for a living, who don't witness this kind of thing on a regular basis. So they may have a completely different perspective. And all of the experts and all of us who are, have nothing else to do while we're waiting and sit around and talk about it. We may be entirely wrong about what they're thinking and what direction they're heading.
Shayna, if Trump is found guilty on just one count, even if there's some weird quirk where he's exonerated on all the others, or they can't come to a decision on the others, he will be convicted of a felony, the first former president to be convicted of a felony. Do you have a sense that the jury has that weight bearing on them?
I do think so. I think they're diligent people. I think they're very smart. I think we've watched them take notes, many of them taking notes the entire time. There are times when they look around the courtroom just to take in the scene. They see all of us. They know that they're part of history. That might be an impression to varying degrees. One juror might realize it more than others. And some of them have expressed being intimidated by that. I think there was one juror early on who came in after they were picked and said, I have concerns about what this is going to be and, my safety. Mm-hmm. They get it. They're human. They're smart. Manhattan is a borough of a lot of educated people. They understand what's going on. They see the cameras. I'm sure they know there are cameras. They see them when they're leaving, and they see a sea of us in the courtroom. They know what this is. They have to put that aside in order to reach a verdict or try to reach a verdict. And that's a huge ask. That is a really big responsibility for 12 regular people who are going to go back to various, routine jobs.
So I'm hearing James say he doubts an acquittal. A clear acquittal will happen. And I'm hearing the rest of you say it's complicated and we'll wait to see what the jurors decide.
I could see a guilty. I could see any outcome,
including an acquittal.
I would put it as a very low probability of that. But I'm watching Juror 2 who said that they get their news from Truth Social.
All right.
Do you want me to weigh in on that? I mean, look, every time I've ever interviewed a jury after a verdict, I've always thought I sat through the whole thing and I'm still not as smart as this person. I have possibly too much faith in jurors. I hope very, very much to learn what they think after. I hope they talk in some fashion. I think they probably will have to, just for their own sense of well-being. I just think jurors are smart, and I look forward to learning what they decided.
Devlin, Shayna, James, Rhonda, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of this. Devlin, Shayna, and Rhonda will be in New York next week, covering the final twists and turns of this historic trial. We'll be here live when the verdict is announced. You can catch us on air. We'll be broadcasting on youtube.com/Washington Post. We'll also be on the Washington Post homepage. Our team of James, Rhonda, and others will be checking in with the reporters who are in the court when they're ready to come out and they finish filing their stories. And you can read all of Devlin and Shayna's reporting as the days go by here. Catch them at the Washington Post website through our daily coverage. And of course, read and subscribe to the Trump Trials newsletter, which lives far beyond this moment, Devlin. You and our colleague Perry Stein are in it for the long haul. And we will have a new episode of the Trump Trials Sidebar when the verdict is announced, as well as next Thursday. So even if the jury is still mulling it over and reinterpreting evidence and re-examining it, we will be here to update everyone with all the latest. I'm Libby Casey, and we'll see you then.